In 2008, Professor John Hattie released his landmark publication, Visible Learning. This book synthesised research from over 800 meta-analyses representing findings from research involving millions of students and over 100 different influences on academic achievement. John's book was widely celebrated for having built that elusive bridge between the field of educational research and practising teachers. Some reviews even described it as the Holy Grail of education. But not all of those in the teaching and research communities were equally pleased with his work, which catalysed a thriving community of critics. And this was a sure sign that John's own educational impact had exceeded even the heights of those very educational influences that sat at the top of his Visible Learning league table. Today's podcast gives Professor Hattie a chance to reflect on all of this and more in light of his forthcoming publication, Visible Learning, the sequel. G'day and welcome to the Powerful Learning Podcast, where our mission is to help you know more, do more and be more by delving into the science of effective learning and teaching. My name's Luke Rowe and I'm a university lecturer and researcher who specialises in evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. And in today's episode, I'll be completing the second part of our two-part podcast series in discussion with one of the world's leading educators, Professor John Hattie. In the first podcast, we covered a lot of ground on topics such as evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. We discussed John's thoughts on success and failure in the classroom, whether or not there is a replication crisis in the field of educational research, and how teachers can add tremendous value to the lives of learners by becoming more evaluative in their approach to teaching. So if you've not yet had the chance to listen to the previous episode, I highly recommend that you do so before this episode. This will help you make better sense of the foundations of our discussion and give you some more context around some of the topics we cover. In this podcast, we shift gears by speaking about John's forthcoming book, Visible Learning, the sequel. We dive into some of the lessons that he's learned over the years since the original version of Visible Learning was released and how he has integrated these lessons into his forthcoming sequel. And I urge you to stick around until the end, where I asked John to engage in a series of big questions with little answers. And it's here that I think John somewhat unknowingly provides a synopsis of his own educational philosophy and passion for teaching and learning. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this second installment of the Powerful Learning Podcast in discussion with Professor John Hattie. Let's change into the weeds of visible learning. So 2008, the book comes out, and it was, if you want to talk about impact on education, this book has probably had more impact, in my view, than any other book released in education in the last couple of decades. And it had impact not just because of the wide readership, I think, it's because the contents themselves were, I think personally, making all of this evidence that we've just discussed, you did the heavy lifting and translated it into a language that was largely user-friendly for teachers. And I feel like they were empowered from your work to access evidence that was previously stuck behind paywalls, that was sitting collecting digital dust in the academic journals and left to translators who would have to wade through the academic jargon that sits around that research. So you kind of distilled a lot of these findings into things like the rank order effect sizes. You also, importantly, and this is, I think, one of the things that people often leave out of criticisms of your work, you included variability estimates, standard error estimates in your original work. You included transparent methodology in how you generated those effect sizes. You certainly looked at minimum benchmarks for acceptable evidence in terms of quality as well. With your hindsight on visible learning, what are some of the impacts that you've seen in terms of how that book has impacted educators and the research community and some of the discourse around this space?
Well, firstly, Luke, it was my 10th book. And as you write a book, sometimes you, as I experienced with the previous one, not many people really care. I never imagined it would have that impact. And as I was writing it, I didn't think that a lot of the ideas were controversial. They turned out to be controversial. The evidence was speaking loud and clear on some of those issues. But the benefit for me in the last 12 years is I now have the world's best critics. Yeah, you said this yourself. Yeah, you could spend your life as an academic and no one could care. And 99% of articles that are published are not cited by anyone, including their own author. So you could easily go to that dust bowl of academia. So the fact that people care, that's probably the most wonderful thing that's happened.
Did you hear sorry to interrupt, I was just going to say, did you hear the average citation in the social sciences is less than one per scientific article, social science article?
Yep.
This is, when you break past that point, you're, I guess, somewhat of a success, but you certainly did more than that.
And so then, I've learned a lot from the critics. I've made a deliberate decision that when people write articles criticizing it, I don't jump away and reply. I've only even replied to one, I think. And that was for a strange reason. I welcome the criticisms. I've learned from some of the criticisms. Some of them I've queried. A couple of years ago, I hunted around with a colleague for about every single criticism we could find. And we did write a monograph outlining the criticisms. Half of them are about the method, and half of them are about my interpretation. 85% of them were about the league table. And the typical argument is it's misleading because they're not unique influences, which proves that those critics never opened page one of the book, because the page one says it's about the overlap, it's about the deep meaning. And that's what took me the 20 years to write the book was about. It even says that in the preface. So those kind of criticisms, you look and say, well, they're easy marks for people. They just didn't like the fact that their pet notion didn't come out of the top, etc. And they're absolutely right. The league table can be misleading if it's used that way.
You were saying if it's used in a either-or sense, that
exactly.
Rather than to say that there's a synergy of using many of these
it was finding the overlap between them.
Yep.
And I don't regret having done it. It did get attention. I do regret that people have misinterpreted in the new sequel. There will not be a ranking. People can rank them if they want. I'm trying to get at the underlying meaning. And so that was a lot of the criticism was about that. And even to this day, it's people write articles and look at it. Well, they clearly haven't read page that. There's a whole chapter there on the school and society, and people say, "Oh, he doesn't talk about what happens outside the school." There's a whole chapter on that in the book. So there's those kind of things you think, well, that's so be it. But then there are some about the nature of the interpretation, and I've had a lot of contact with a lot of readers who made suggestions that I hope I've listened to. A lot of the criticisms of meta-analysis, some I share, like. Too many of them are criticisms of the method. Now, you name me any method in the world, and I can tell you what can go wrong. When people use those methods, they try and make sure those things that go wrong don't go wrong. And so, yes, in meta-analyses, you do need to be careful about finding the right moderators, finding a right and looking at the variability. And the whole core of meta-analysis is two things. What's the average effect? How big is it? And what are the moderators, the influences on? And most of the critics forget that second part of the whole point of meta-analysis. And the whole point of it. Now, I do point out in visible learning that they're very hard to find. And that really upset a lot of people. Like every teacher, every principal starts with the same premise. My class is unique. And what visible learning says, that's just not true. And that upset a lot. Now, it's not saying your class of kids aren't unique. What it's saying is what works best in your class is not different. Now, we did say this in the book, that maybe our work shouldn't generalize to countries that have lower resources. And a couple of years ago, Aaron Hamilton and I found about 800 meta-analyses of random control studies in lower resource countries, and we published a book on that, and there are different answers. So that is a huge moderate, but otherwise, no. And so, yeah, I've learned a lot from those critics, and I'm so grateful that they're out there. And I hope when they see the sequel, they'll see some of their influences in it, and sometimes they won't, because some of them I don't agree with. Maybe one day I'll get down and write the definitive critique of all the critiques, but I think that's a very useful thing to do. What's wrong with criticism? Let others do that.
Yeah, well said. I don't know many people in academia who can take criticism on the chin, so to speak, like you can.
But that's their job. Like, if you're going to be wrong, that's the essence of scientific research is looking for evidence you're wrong. You want critics. And you know, Luke, as a new researcher, finding your colleagues who are prepared to critique you before a review journalist does is an unbelievable big asset. And with your students, who teaches them to critique? And there's a skill in that. And it's like the old standby, you critique the idea, not the person, and learning how to do that. Watching the reception of critique. It's like watching principals do performance evaluation where they do critique. There's an art in that. And that's the art we all need to learn as young teachers, young researchers.
And just as a side note, one thing that was a really vivid example to me when I was working with the Science and Learning Research Centre at the University of Melbourne was that you're the only academic I know who invited one of your biggest critics over for a 2-week stay from the other side of the world, just to flesh out plenty of these points of difference and put it into a book. And this type of thing, for me, shows that you were prepared to practice what you preach, in the sense of letting failure and criticism be the best friend of your way forward towards success.
Goodness, did I learn so much from Stan? He's a sociologist. He comes from a philosophical background, which is not mine. And so this is my notion of multiple methods. You have people who think differently to interpret your work so you can think better. Oh my gosh, what an honor that was. So yeah, that was a great, I worried beforehand that it wouldn't be.
An honor to invite one of your harshest critics to spend 2 weeks with you and still come out of it with your ego intact. This is a pretty unique perspective on learning as an academic yourself, a lifelong academic. You're certainly been on a steep learning curve the whole time, and this has never stopped. You haven't lost momentum right into the last few years of your professorship. Still taking on swallowing those bitter pills that people offer ever so freely on your work. People are very forthcoming to give you advice about how you should do your work differently. But I guess, that definitive critique may in fact be less worthy of your time than just the update of the book and focusing on the positive aspect of it. So let's shift gears to that, just because I feel like that's an opportune moment where you've got this new copy of Visible Learning. What's the title? Have you worked on that yet?
Yep, Visible Learning, the sequel.
In terms of, you mentioned one of the differences is that you don't have the lead table, the ranking, right? So how do you then, as a person who's going to critically consume your book and extract from it that which they think is going to enable them to put their best foot forward in the classroom, how do they then make sense of that? Because, the blessing and the curse of that ranking chart, for better or worse, it made the argument implicitly, at least, or you've done it quite explicitly, that some research is better than others. Some interventions are better than others and more effective than others. And here's some evidence for that, right? So how do you not shoot yourself in the foot when you've taken away this ranking table?
Because I'm spending a lot more time realizing it's a sequel and it's 12 years later on what is the story, and then hanging the data off the story. Whereas in Visible Learning, I was using the evidence to build a story. What I would argue, not just from the 1,300 new meta-analyses that are beyond the 800 that were in Visible Learning, I've also been working in about 10,000 schools and building evidence from that over the last 10 years. And so bringing some of that to elaborate the story. So the story takes a much higher profile in this book. There's two chapters 3 and 4 are devoted to what that story is from the perspective of the teacher, the student, the leader, and the parent, and making that story the essence of it. And the data then is there, and I do look at the 350 influences now compared to 130 in the Visible Learning book. But I knew that when I first looked at a second edition, just expanding from the 150 to 350, I would have lost even more people in the detail. So it's on its head. So the story takes a much more stronger position. And if you don't like the story, well, that's what I want the debate to be about, how to improve that story, how to make it better.
Can you give us a bit of a sneak preview as to what the story is?
Well, one of the new notions is the intentional alignment. If you look at like the work that we were doing in the Science and Learning Centre with Greg Donoghue and others, looking at that surface, deep and transfer, which I'm renaming knowing how and knowing with. I kind of like surface, deep and transfer, but too many people misinterpret surface as shallow. And so
negative.
there is content, there is the knowing how, and then there's not using it, and with and other subjects, the transfer. But here's the problem, Luke. The learning strategies differ at those three levels. The teaching strategies, in terms of their effectiveness, there's a lot of evidence they differ. And when I match up the learning strategies with, for instance, Bob Mazzano's 380 different teaching methods, there's virtually no relationship. Teaching is almost independent of the learning. And fascinating, those of your students who look up the jigsaw method, it's one of the very few methods that actually follow a learning model. And that's why it's so successful. And so aligning the success criteria, the assessments, the activities, the teaching, the feedback, the marking, etc., with those 3 levels is the key. And that's one of the big new notions, because you take some of the teaching, like take problem-based teaching. We don't have to do another meta-analysis. No, it's one of our most abject failures. But the reason it's a failure is it's introduced before the students have the content. But if it's introduced after the student have the content, it's a very successful method. So for those who say problem-based method, good or bad, I'm saying no. To what degree is it aligned with the intention? Now here's the rub. Despite what teachers say and think and do, when you ask students about what the nature of the learning is in the class, it's nearly always about knowing lots. And so aligning how students do it. And so the answer is pretty simple, actually. Have 2 assessments, work backwards. And you tell the students, this assessment is about the content and the knowing skills. This assessment's about interpreting it. Why should the students have to guess what you want? If you're a student and you want to be safe, the guess is easy, no lots. Like we know in undergraduate universities, one of the best predictors of outcomes of essays is the number of references, even if they're wrong. We want to hear back that you have content and you have justification.
Yeah. So
have 2 assessments, have 2 success criteria, and get that alignment right and constantly check. Now, here's the hard part. Let me go to jargon here for a moment. Cognitive task analysis. Huge effects. It comes out of orthopedic surgery and aeronautics. Working out what the nature of the cognitive complexity of the task is, so you can be clear about what skills are then needed to be able to do that, is a key step to being successful.
So this is the work. I've seen some military studies on this where it is about trying to accelerate learning by distilling what the key features of the mental model of an expert were. And then trying to explicate those for novices to then take on board in their first steps in learning about that particular concept or field. So that seems though that it's like jumping in the deep end, right? So what you're saying though is it's almost like there's a Matthew effect here where you need to have this, for lack of a better term, the knowing. Is it the knowing that correlates to the surface knowledge? Yeah. Okay. So you've got to know that. And that's like the gateway to learning more. It puts you onto this Matthew effect, this snowballing of the more you know, the more you will be able to know later on. And so you've got these types of moderators of minimum thresholds of prior learning that determine the efficacy of the subsequent teaching approach and the learning approaches. And so that really throws the complexity into the discussion.
Let me add another concept to that, because I want to be a little bit careful about what you're saying. Like I look at the work of Manav Kapoor, for example, and what he's demonstrated that if you start with a problem-based situation and you learn what the students don't understand, how they're not making connections, that can be a very valuable place to start. So maybe you don't always have to start with the content of what they do or they don't know, because it's the relationships between the ideas that the kids bring to the class too. And so often that's what the issue is. So don't assume that the model therefore says we have to go content, then deep, then surface. Sorry, surface, then deep, then transfer. Sometimes we need to start at different points, which I think opens up a creativity, which I think is quite exciting. But you're right. And I need your help, Luke, and your students' help is to be, how can we be smarter at translating that notion of cognitive task analysis? Because it really isn't easy, but surely teachers are the experts. Surely they can say, if you're going to learn how to do a fraction or a distillation or play a piece of jazz music, you should be able to work out what are the relationships between the ideas, what is the content they need to know, and how do you put those 2 things together in the right way and form, which is the teaching act.
So we take away this, one of the things that I think is really interesting here is that we take away this almost like a hierarchy of knowledge that some people implicitly carry around with them when it comes to learning. They talk about rote learning as perhaps akin to superficial knowledge and surface knowledge. They almost look at that as antithetical to the deeper, meaningful learning. But what you're saying is not necessarily a hierarchy of knowledge here, so much as a 360-degree space that you need to consider learning within. It's a much more complex space. But
you're right, but not too complex. Like, for instance, the model that Greg and I developed makes a big distinction between when you are first exposed and acquire knowledge and when you consolidate it. And I'm not sure we're as good at teaching the consolidation. And you take a thing like memorization, at the acquiring stage, it has an effect size of 0.03. At the consolidating phase, it has an effect size of 0.73. So there's a right time for memorization. Now, it's probably no surprise that you helped us. We call our model the Kenny Rogers model. There's a right time to play them, there's a right time to hold them. And all those people who say memorization's bad have forgotten that consolidation is really powerful. Now, here's the rub. If you consolidate knowledge for short-term gain, like pass a test, then the fade factor is ginormous. And if you consolidate knowledge to go on to deep learning, the positive effect is almost accelerant. So there's a time and place for different kinds of learning strategies. And that's part of the message in the book too, and trying to be clear what that time and place are. And it really is that sort of almost six-fold model, the knowing that, the knowing how, the knowing with, when you're first exposed, and then when you consolidate.
But what's missing from there that just speaks to that Kenny Rogers model is knowing when, right? And this is something we worked on in the past. Maybe there's a fourth dimension there.
Look, you're so right. And I just find it fascinating that when we did the review in that Science and Learning Center of what studies out there are on the knowing when, we couldn't find any.
Yeah.
And if you remember Jay Berkeley, who came across and joined us, he was doing a specific study of trying to see whether you could actually detect in the visualizations of kids when they made a connection. And he was successful.
What he called an aha moment.
Correct. And well, too, and I'm sure your students do, when you're reading something and suddenly it clicks, it is kind of a joyful moment. It is like, and afterwards you say, it's so obvious. It wasn't before. And I think that's really is a very, something we need to be a lot clearer about. So yes, you're absolutely right. There's a knowing when, and like in the sequel, I call it the readiness notion. How do you know that there's a readiness to move on to those next levels? So that knowing when is very, very powerful.
So let's ask this question about the hinge point. I can't avoid that when we talk about an update of visible learning. The hinge point was it was in itself a metaphorical hinge point for your critics as well, and for those who followed your work happily. But certainly the hinge point was, for a lot of people, a useful way to adjudicate what was worthwhile in the classroom and what was not necessarily as fruitful. But then there were those who said that is a terrible sort of mechanism for adjudicating quality, and you got lots of criticism for that as well. So talk to me about the hinge point in the new book. Is this going to be there?
Well, interestingly, when you add 1,300 new meta-analyses on top of the 800, the hinge point doesn't change at the decimal point. It's still 0.4. And the reason that I use it and call it a hinge point is that I wanted to understand what were the underlying factors of those influences above and below that hinge point. Because one of the things which actually shocked me, I never expected the distribution to look like it did. I expected a lot more effects to be negative, and there are hardly any. And so just finding and asking the question about what works is a pretty barren question. And so the hinge point was to try and raise the ante and say, no, let's raise it. Because like some of my critics say, oh, you can't get an effect size that's greater than 0.4. Well, they fail to realize that half of them already are. So sorry, guys, a bit of reality training there. Now, I do need to be a little careful here, Luke. One of the biggest moderators, and I pointed it out in the 2008 book, is how wide or narrow is the outcome. Like if you're looking for a narrow outcome like vocabulary increase, you're more likely to get a higher effect size than if you look at something like creativity. So that's really an important part of it. The other thing is that when you're introducing something for the first time, you're usually much more attuned to whether it's working or not. And so in many ways, there is a novelty effect when you first do something. And that's, some people call it the Hawthorne effect. And I want to capitalize on that. I want teachers to almost every time they introduce something, even though they've been teaching for 30 years, it should be the first time. Like I've stood up to more audiences than I can imagine, particularly in the first 5 or 6 years, talking about what visible learning is, and I can do it in my sleep. But every time I went up onto that stage, I said, for this audience, it's the first time. So to me, it's the first time. And that's the kind of mentality I want the teachers to think about, that novelty effect. So yes, there can be a novelty effect, there can be a Hawthorne effect, but I hope it's more than that, because that hinge point hasn't changed. There's still many effects above 0.4. We've worked in our 10,000 schools, and we know, because we monitor this very closely, we can get every kid getting effect sizes greater than 0.4 over a year on things that really matter. And that's what we aim for. We're not as religious to say that that's, and in some classes, the effect size is much higher. And in cases when it's lower, we also look at that and we say to the teacher, look, overall, this is your average. Let's look at those kids which you're having success with and those you're not. What's going on here? So that hinge point has proved to be very valuable, but yeah, it's still going to be subject of critique.
You're just going to have to wear that again. You've had enough of that over your career. I'm sure you can take a little bit more. You know, it reminds me of this idea of seeing your job with a fresh set of eyes. As a teacher, you know, you approach the students in the classroom anew each day. And it reminds me of this T.S. Eliot saying something along the lines of learning is like arriving at the beginning and seeing it for the first time.
So for your students, it is.
Yes. Yep. And it's, I think in mindfulness, they talk about the beginner's mindset. Perhaps this is a common thread and a lot of people are converging on a similar point that you're making there. All right. So now we've got this adjudicator of quality with the hinge point, and that has been useful. And for me personally, I've found it quite interesting and useful. But I, in the past, have proposed to you in some of the research we've looked at hierarchies of evidence. And when I've raised that with you in the past, you've not been a big fan. So can you explain to me sort of your perspective on hierarchies of evidence? And I guess what's coming to mind here, just as an example of what I mean by that, is in medicine, they have a hierarchy of evidence where they've got at the very, sitting at the top of that hierarchy are meta-analyses, systematic reviews comprising meta-analyses, which themselves are comprised of randomized controlled trials of large sample sizes, right? So that's the pinnacle of high quality evidence. And it's often seen as a nail in the coffin for definitive and conclusive evidence in their field. But, and at the bottom there is perhaps observational studies, case studies, and single trial case control studies that you can't have much inferential value necessarily on their own grounds, under their own weight. You've got all these different types of studies in between. So what's your perspective on that? You're saying that there are ways of adjudicating quality, but the hierarchy of evidence, it's lost on you. Why?
It is. You go back to the start and say, what are the two things that we want to do when we do research? We want to have the power to convince, and we want to have the power to have generalizability. And they're almost like two ends of a seesaw. You never have enough money to do a large enough study to convince the 20 or so, 50 or 100 or 3,000 different people that you have in your audience. The convincing power, this is where the qualitative studies are often very good, because I'm doing it on you, Luke. And therefore I'm doing the study so it has high convincing power. But it's getting that balance, and all research design is always about that balance. So let's start with that premise. And then my argument is that method could never be the quality control. Like I could tell you about some large randomized control studies that are criminally, hopelessly done. But they're randomized control studies, so they meet the quality criteria. No way. The other thing is when you look at, for instance, What Works Clearinghouse, which you can't get into unless you use randomized control studies. They have about 170 odd different reviews that they've put up there. What's the average number of studies in each of those reviews? And let me give you one example. One of those reviews is on the teaching of reading. What's the average number of studies that meet their criteria? 2. Now, I don't think you're saying anything if you set a standard where you exclude almost everything. One of the reasons that meta-analysis, which is not at the highest, but it's the second level down, one of the reasons it's so successful, I would argue, is because it actually asks about the moderators that might make a difference. And it allows for studies that are unlike randomized control to say, does it make a difference? But they also have quality measures on. There's some lousy meta-analyses out there, some very good ones. And so having a method, I go back to the Popper argument. It's that ability to come up with a convincible, generalizable argument that's subjected to critique and criticism. And a really good study, and in the sequel, I try and raise this in the last chapter, changes the question. Doesn't necessarily answer. Like, I would like to argue that I've tried to move the question away from what works to what works best. I like to argue that it's not what you know that matters as much as what you don't know that matters as much. And I've got about 25 different questions that I want to change the area to say, these are the things we should worry about. And so any kind of argument that looks at method as the answer to hierarchy of quality, to me, is misleading. Now, let me be very quick to say, I care about the quality of the methodology, whether it be a case study, a meta-analysis, or a random control study.
Okay.
I care about the robustness, replication of the finding, and have introduced that as a new measure in the sequel. But please don't tell me that because you did a randomized control study, therefore it is the highest quality. It may be, it may not be.
Yeah, what you're saying, from what I'm gathering here with this point of quality adjudicating, you're saying the methodology alone needs to be petitioned away from the notion of quality, because within each approach to research, you can have its own continuum of high to low quality. And therefore, when you start to have a hierarchy of evidence, it undermines that proposition.
There was a great study done in the 1990s where they looked at 200 or 300 articles that had been published in top quality psych journals and 200 or 300 articles that had been rejected from those journals. And they looked at the different elements of the article. And the question here is, and I know I've asked you this before, so I'm asking your audience this. One part of the article mattered. Was it the title? Was it the authors? Was it where they came from? Was it the abstract, the introduction, the literature review, the method, the results, or the conclusions? One of those dominated whether the article was published or not, and it was the conclusions. And that should speak a lot. If you're not saying anything, who cares about how the quality of your method is? So we've got to say stuff, and we've got to say stuff that goes back to, aha, I hadn't thought of it that way. And like my advice to all your students when you pick up an article, read the conclusion first. If it doesn't say anything, there's no point battling through all the rest of it. It's not going to tell you much. If you really like the conclusions, go back and check how they did it, what was going on. And so I think this is another part of the quality of studies is, do they say something? Do they question? Do they lead to different kinds of questions? Do they lead to different kinds of notions? And that to me has got a lot more going for it in terms of the quality of a study. Does it add to the corpus? Does it critique the corpus? Does it check the corpus? Does it help it have a better understanding of it? Now, in many ways, that's an individual notion. But on the other hand, if you go back and look over the history of ed psych of any area, there are some key big ideas that have come out that have changed the way we've looked at that world. There are some very key articles that have done better to understand that world. And those are the ones that stick out, and that's what quality is about.
Interesting. All right, John, we're going to finish on a strong note. Big questions, little answers. We'll start with this first question. The purpose of education is?
To see our impact through the eyes of students, to teach students to become their own teachers, and for us to become students of our own teaching.
It's a visible learning synopsis right there. All right, second question. Biggest strength of our teaching profession is?
We already have some stunning, excellent educators in our system. If only we had the courage to reliably identify them and scale up our excellence we have, whereas too often we spend our time finding our failures and dwelling on that.
Can't agree more. Can't agree more. All right, third question. The most important difference a teacher can make on the lives of their students is?
To either turn the kids onto their passion or to see something in the kids the kids doesn't see in themselves.
Wonderful. Fourth question. The most important work being done in the field of educational research is?
Deciding on the right questions and developing the skills of critique.
Been spending your whole career doing that. Or at least your adversaries have. All right, fifth question. If we keep doing blank, the education sector will be a huge failure.
If we keep basing our system on the promotion of age and experience as opposed to expertise, our education sector will be a huge failure.
Wow, we could do another podcast unpacking that. That is absolutely emanating with all sorts of nuance. But for time's sake, we won't go into that. All right, question number 6. The most important habit a teacher can cultivate is?
I'm going to have 2. Is to be nosy and to find a critic of your nosiness.
Finding a critic, I'm sure everyone's going to be very enthusiastic about that one. And being nosy, you're going to have to figure out a better way to sell that one, John.
Yeah, well, it's that evaluative thinking notion about you actually wants to constantly check whether your interpretation as the teacher is the same as what the kids are doing, and as a consequence, make the changes. Yep.
Hey, it's okay. You're speaking to someone who's pretty nosy about your research anyway, so I think I can attest to that being a good thing for learning. All right, question number 7. The most meaningful change a school leader can make to improve the learning outcomes among students is?
To help teachers understand whether every kid in that class feels invited to come to class each day to learn.
This is speaking to that point about your model of learning, where they have the will, the skill, and the thrill.
And the culture of learning, about whether it is a place that kids want to come back to. Like at the end of primary school, start of high school, about 4 out of 10 kids at best want to come to school to learn the stuff teachers teach. Do you know those 4? Do you know the other 6? And what are you doing about it?
Wow. Yep. Again, that's another podcast topic, that one. All right, final question. The most significant influence a person has had on your research career is?
Nicely telling me where I'm wrong and how I can improve.
So your adversaries are really also your best friends in that sense. And this is where you're actually living as an example of failure becoming your best friend.
And one of the examples of that, one of the reasons I loved being an academic was my 200 thesis students, of which you were one. You had no troubles telling me where I hadn't got it wrong, how I could improve.
Oh, I remember those debates. I remember we were 26 emails deep on the growth mindset debate that we had. that went on for like 6 months.
What an honor and a privilege it is to have worked with some of the sharpest minds in the business who also love the critique and the debate. That's why being an academic is such a fun job.
Yeah, right. You're one of those real masochists who like to have his ego crushed regularly. So maybe that's a good thing if you want to put that on if you're going for a research role, folks, put that on your CV.
Yeah, but I can turn that on you, Luke. You're one of the best at
it. Thanks. That's why you wanted me to be working with you. All right. So one final question, just generally, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners that we haven't already had a chance to discuss?
Yeah, but you have to invite me back.
Yeah, I think that might be worthwhile. It's been a pretty fruitful discussion.
I love talking about this, and I hope your students love talking about their impact that they're having on their students and on their fellow teachers.
Brilliant. John, thank you so much for your time. I'm always grateful for it. Now that concludes the second part of our two-part discussion on evidence-based teaching in the science of learning with Professor John Hattie. There were a few things that really stood out to me during our conversation. The first was John's willingness and desire to learn from his critics. The second was how important it is to be an evaluative thinker and to be nosy about what your students are learning. And the third and final point that really struck a chord with me was John's notion of intentional alignment, which he revealed is going to make up a major component of visible learning, the sequel. So let me briefly summarise each of these key points. The first was John's willingness and desire to learn from his critics. John mentioned that visible learning resulted in him having the world's best critics, and rather than shying away from these criticisms, he expressed gratitude for them. Firstly, because it proved that people cared and were paying attention to, debating and discussing educational evidence. And secondly, John was grateful for his critics because it gave him an opportunity to learn from them. As far as those criticisms go, he said that about half tended to be about his visible learning meta-synthesis methodology, which combines results from multiple meta-analyses, and the other half of those criticisms tended to be about his interpretation of those results. But the larger trend that he discovered was that around 85% of criticisms were about the lead table, which is a table that he used to rank each educational influence from highest to lowest effect in terms of how it influences academic achievement in educational settings. And this led John to make some major changes to visible learning, the sequel. The first major change that he mentioned is that he's now determined to focus more on the underlying message and the story that evidence is telling us. Specifically, John alluded to this story revolving less around simplistic either-or comparisons of effect sizes and more around a nuanced evaluation, an interpretation, and an implementation of educational evidence in the messy context of the classroom, which has led him to remove altogether the rank order effect sizes from his sequel. That said, John mentioned that one of the central findings of his original visible learning work, the hinge point, remains unchanged to the second decimal place with a Cohen's d effect size of 0.4, despite adding over 1,200 new meta-analyses to the sample. Now, what does that mean? First, it suggests that John's original findings around the average effect size of educational influences are highly robust. The results aren't changing in the face of new data. Second, it suggests that asking what works is a futile question because, as John demonstrates from his research, almost everything seems to work in educational research. He therefore encourages us to stop asking what works and to instead begin to ask what works best. He also mentioned that it's often more helpful to get clear on what we don't know instead of what we do know. John speaks to this point in the context of the great philosopher of science, Karl Popper, who developed his approach to science known as falsificationism, where a scientific theory or hypothesis about what works in education must be articulated in a way that can be disproven or falsified. John also alluded to the inverse of the falsification principle, which is sometimes called verificationism, by arguing that effective research involves the power to convince and the power to generalize as evidence accumulates in favour of a theory that withstands falsification. His lay summary of these principles is to suggest that we need to develop an approach to teaching that protects us from confirming our pet theories and prior beliefs, which is basically to avoid confirmation bias. Now, the second point that really struck me about what John was saying was how important it is to be an evaluative thinker and to be nosy about what our students are learning. John mentioned the late Graham Nuttall's research on classroom learning, showing that students often know most of the lesson content before the teacher teaches it, which means that a lot of time is being wasted on things that students have already mastered. The nosy teacher doesn't settle for this. Rather, they keep tabs on what their students know at any given time, and they continue to ask themselves what they can do to move beyond this threshold, which speaks to John's now famous saying, to know thy impact, where teachers stop assuming that the act of teaching somehow magically results in learning and instead develop different ways of knowing if and how their teaching influences the learning of their students. And the third and final point that really resonated with me was John's notion of intentional alignment. He mentioned this speaks to the notion of surface, deep, and transfer of knowledge, which is really echoing the sentiments of John Biggs's work from the late 1980s. He talks about how different success criteria, different assessments, different teaching activities, different ways of approaching feedback and marking need to be aligned with each of these three cycles of learning. John used that notion of problem-based learning to speak to this point because problem-based learning, when enacted at the beginning of a learning cycle where the knowledge is at the surface level and it's pretty shallow, doesn't have a very big effect on learning outcomes. However, when you've got to that deep level of knowledge and there's already a foundation of knowledge built, problem-based learning can have an enormous effect on further compounding learning and mastery over learning goals. So in other words, it's vital to know at what point in the learning cycle our students are at so that we can know when to introduce different approaches to teaching and learning in order to maximize their impact. I asked John if that was like having to reach a minimum threshold of prior learning before we can unlock the potential of different learning and teaching strategies. However, he warned me that this isn't so straightforward because the order in which we tackle learning does not always fit the surface-deep transfer cycle in step-like fashion, but instead it can be attacked from multiple angles depending on where the students are at with their baseline knowledge and skills, which he said opens up an important opportunity for teachers to become creative in their craft. Now that concludes the second part of our two-part discussion on evidence-based teaching and the science of learning with Professor John Hattie. But one thing I would like to mention before I bring this podcast to a close is that I'm extremely grateful that John was willing to share his time with us and to allow me to put some of his ideas to the test. I'd also like to remind you of what John said at the end of the podcast in the final segment, Big Questions and Little Answers. That's where I asked him what the most important difference a teacher can make on the life of a student is. And John answered by saying that it is to turn students onto their passion and to see something in the student that they cannot see in themselves. When I heard John say this, I couldn't help but think that this is exactly the effect that he's had on my life. And for that, I'm forever in his debt. Now that's about all we have time for in today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about the release of upcoming content or support this program, I'll include links in the show notes. Until next time, may you continue to learn powerfully.